Spectacular song, Eliyahu Hanavi by Rabbi Shlomo Katz from Efrat in the Holy Land. How are you, my sisters and brothers? It's Tuesday. Let's light up the darkness. Who is going to be with us on this fine evening as we examine the question, how big is God's backyard? James Roth with us from Indianapolis, Melissa Eitzel-Jurin from Great Neck, New York, Judith Sobel from Florence, South Carolina, Brenna Bloomfield from Sharon, Mass., Diane McGuire from Indiana, Sandy McMurray says Michigan is in the house, Chuck Wright with us from West Virginia, Donna Smith from Bahama, North Carolina, Bill Eldridge from Rainey, Arkansas, Cliff Purcell from Grandview, Washington, Miriam Tuffick from New York, Yafa Hassel from Ohio, Jacob Ryan Rigsby from 91 Watchers, Psalm 91, Lucy Ron Johnson from Minneapolis, Annie McGregor says Michigan is in the house, Amy Kulesa from Maryland, Zipporah Bank in the house from Hancock Park, Los Angeles, Jacob says Texas tips the hat. Stephanie Marie Diaz says Shalom Aleichem. Frona Adelson says hello. Sue Strauss in the house from Chicago. Stephen Giger from Dover, New Hampshire. Bella Rubin is with us as well. Over on YouTube, Miracia Janut is with us and saying thank you for sharing these wonderful Torah lessons. You're so very welcome. We are in Elul this morning. I shared a great story. If you haven't seen it, check it out. The story of the ship, the shofar, and the storm. The story of Rabbi Elazar Rokeach, the chief rabbi of Amsterdam, a trip he took to the Holy Land, ended up being on the ship during Rosh Hashanah when a storm set in. Check that one out. Just in case you haven't heard the shofar today, we blow the shofar every day in Elul. Let me blow the shofar for you. It is a wake-up call every day this month, the Hebrew month of Elul, the last month of the year. We wake up, we examine our deeds because we're preparing for Rosh Hashanah, when every soul in the world will come before the heavenly court and receive a decree for the coming year. This is the time to increase our mitzvahs, to increase our good deeds, to increase our acts of love and compassion toward our fellow creatures so that we may be judged compassionately. It is also definitely a good time to increase our giving to charitable causes. And if you want to, and particularly to support organizations that share Torah, if you'd like to support our nonprofit, we are Accidental Talmudist, and you can donate at donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. Nina will put that link in the comments. Okay, let's get to it. Where are we? We are holding on Daf Chaf Gimel, that's page 23 of Tractate Eruvin. This is the third volume of the Talmud. We are in chapter 2. Today we're going to begin and end, because it's a very short discussion, Mishnah number 3, and open our discussion of Mishnah number 4 in this chapter. Mishnah number 3 teaches that we can use this virtual enclosure made of just a few upright boards in the corners, as we've been talking about, that we can make an enclosure around the well, and we call it a virtual enclosure. I mean, that's modern terminology, but it is not a complete enclosure, right? So we're not defining this private domain in the normal way, which would be to make a full enclosure around this area so that we can carry there on Shabbos. But because there's such a public benefit to having a well that is easily accessible and it's in the public domain, so maybe nobody's going to go to the trouble to put a full enclosure around it, but just so that people can use it on Shabbos and draw water out of it, we just put up some corner posts. Now, this idea of the virtual enclosure defined by corner posts is going to be available to what? We've just been calling it a well. Here in this third Mishnah of chapter 2, we're going to get a little bit more specific. What kind of well? So what we learn is it can be a publicly owned well, right? So a well in the public thoroughfare. It's owned by the public, and it's served by a running spring. It's a well that has tapped into a spring, right? Running spring water. It's not going to work. Well, let's see how the Mishnah puts it. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says that boards are, let me just get this in front of me. Yeah, the Mishnah speaks first, and then Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava is going to disagree a little bit. So the Mishnah says that in the case of a public cistern containing collected water, as well as a public well containing spring water, and a private well, one may arrange the upright boards around them. Okay, so a public well served by spring water, or a public cistern served by rainwater. It collects rainwater. Or a private well, these boards in the corners are going to work. But a private cistern, right? So just somebody's cistern on their property that collects rainwater, that's not going to work with the corner posts and the virtual enclosure. We're going to require a full enclosure around that. Okay? Consequently, it is impossible to permit drawing from it on Shabbat by means of boards set up in the corners. Rather, one must construct the proper partition 10 handbreadths high. This is the statement of Rabbi Akiva. So Rabbi Akiva is saying that there's 3 categories work with the corner posts: public well, public cistern, private well. But if it's a private cistern, then that's going to need the full enclosure. That's Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says we can use the corner posts only for the public well that is fed by spring water, but the public cistern, the private well, and clearly, and therefore, of course, the private cistern, all of these are not going to work with just the virtual enclosure made of corner posts. For any one of those other 3 categories, we're going to need the full enclosure in order to permit drawing water out of them on Shabbos. That's Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava's statement. Then the Gemara comes in, very short discussion, and Rav Yosef says, in the name of Rav Yehuda, in the name of Shmuel, that the halacha, the law, accords with Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So we're going to only use this virtual enclosure, this great leniency established by the rabbis to permit transfer from this private domain, which is the well itself, out of it, right, and basically into the public domain, but we're going to turn it into an enlarged private domain where we can draw that water only in the case of a public well fed by a running spring, not one that collects rainwater from the immediate area, as it were. And that's it. That's the whole discussion of Mishnah number 3. We continue Mishnah number 4 with another statement of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. So now we're going to talk about, we talked a little bit before about how big that enclosure can be. And we saw that some of the sages said it can only be 2 base sa, meaning 5,000 square cubits, or a square that's about 70 and a fraction cubits by 70 and a fraction cubits, right? 70, and 70.8, something like that, times 70.8 is going to be about 5,000 square cubits. And so Yehuda ben Bava said that a garden or an enclosed courtyard used for storage, meaning not a courtyard or a backyard or a pen or a stable or an enclosure that is attached to a dwelling, right? It's an enclosure somewhere else. And the way this normally would work in Talmudic times is like the people lived in the town where it was safe. Right? They lived in a little city that was a walled city surrounded by a wall, and everybody had their dwellings there because they were protected by that wall of the town. But they had land outside the city walls. So people had their fields. Like today, we're just used to that a farm, right? It's the farmhouse and its fields. But it wasn't always like that. Often they had their homes in the town and their fields were outside the town. Okay, so if you're talking about an enclosure that is not attached to a dwelling, now we're talking about how big that can be and what are its requirements. So Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says, okay, a garden or an enclosed courtyard that's used for storage, meaning not attached to a dwelling, its limit is about 70 and a fraction cubits by 70 and a fraction cubits, meaning about 5,000 square cubits. This is the area that we've been calling 2 base sa, meaning the amount of space necessary to grow 2 measures of grain. But as we're going to see, that measure, 5,000 cubits, is related to the tabernacle, and we're going to talk more about that. At any rate, Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava says that's how big it can be, and it's okay for carrying, provided that this enclosure also contains one of the following 3 objects or elements. Either it contains a watchman's booth, right? So the watchman, where remember, all the people live in that little walled city, their fields, right, which is the source of their wealth, right? Where this is an agricultural society. They live in the town, but their fields are outside the town. And so sometimes they would hire, especially around harvest time, watchmen to sort of live in these little booths to watch over the fields to make sure thieves don't come and steal the products of the harvest. So this enclosure, in order that if we want to permit carrying in that enclosure on Shabbos, it has to contain either a watchman's booth or some kind of a dwelling, or be near enough to the town where the owner lives, right? How near, they argue a little bit about that. Is it within 70 cubits of the town? Is it within 2,000 cubits of the town? For right now, we're just saying it has to be near the town. Okay, then if it has one of those 3 things, contains a watchman's booth or a dwelling, or it's near the town, then we can carry in that enclosure on Shabbos so long as it's within that measure of about 70 by 70 cubits. That's the opinion of Rabbi Yehuda ben Bava. Rabbi Yehuda, not Yehuda ben Bava, but Rabbi Yehuda, the Rabbi Yehuda we've been talking about so often. Rabbi Yehuda says it doesn't have to contain necessarily a watchman's booth or a dwelling. It doesn't have to be so near the town. But what it does have to contain is either a cistern or a water ditch or a cave. In other words, a source of water. It has to have some kind of a source of water, which would sort of justify that this is a place that is, attractive to people. It has to do with people and that they might want to take a drink while they're there. And that's what's going to permit carrying within this enclosure. Then comes Rabbi Akiva. He says, no, you don't have to have a watchman's booth. You don't have to have a dwelling. You don't have to have a ditch or a cistern or some other source of water or a cave in there. The only requirement is that it is less than the 5,000 cubits and that it's enclosed, right? So it has to be enclosed. It can't just be, a virtually defined plot of land. It has to have an enclosure around it, and it can't be bigger than 70 by 70 and a fraction cubits. Rabbi Eliezer says, yeah, you're talking about 70 and a fraction by 70 and a fraction, and that's the shape that it has to be. It has to be a square to permit carrying there. If it's some other shape, it doesn't work. Rabbi Yosei says, no, it doesn't have to be a square. Even if the length is twice the width, it's fine. It can be a rectangle. We are not concerned that it is a square. Rabbi Elai says in the Mishnah, I heard from Rabbi Eliezer, the great Rabbi Eliezer, that the enclosure can be much bigger than what you guys are talking about. It can be a base core, which is 15 times bigger than two base sa. It can be much bigger type of courtyard. But says Rabbi Elai, I heard Rabbi Eliezer say that, but I asked around everyone else that was a student of Rabbi Eliezer, and nobody else heard him say it. So I can't verify that it's true. He sort of says, I heard him say it, but since I can't find anyone else who heard him say it, I guess maybe it's, I'm in doubt. I'm in doubt whether that's true or not. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara says, so where do we get this 5,000 cubits measure? So where that comes from, it's not from a square that's 70 cubits by 70 cubits. It comes from a rectangle that's specified in the Bible that's 100 cubits by 50 cubits. Let me get this figure open. So I didn't have that ready. Here we go. And you might recognize this. Okay. So what do we have here? We are looking at a rendition, an artist's rendering of the tabernacle of the children of Israel in the desert. You can see that it's surrounded by a huge encampment full of tents. Those are the tents, the ones that are immediately neighboring are the encampment of the Levites. And then beyond them would be the other 12 tribes. This is the Mishkan. And you can see that it's a big courtyard that's surrounded by these partitions. And that courtyard, how big is it? It's 50 cubits wide by 100 cubits long. So this is God's yard in this world, as it were. It's called a Mishkan. We translate that typically as a tabernacle. And that's because the sanctuary, as it were, that tent structure toward the back, that's where we have the Holy and the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant is kept. But when we talk about the Mishkan, we're really talking about this whole structure. And the word Mishkan doesn't mean tent. The word Mishkan means dwelling, right? So the concept is God is everywhere. We are inside God. But God will make manifestations of God's self where and when God chooses. And one of those manifestations was in this Mishkan in the desert, right? And later in the Holy Temple. So the Temple Mount, as we call it in English, once the temple was built, right, it was the place was chosen. The mountain in Jerusalem was chosen by David, and then Solomon built the temple. We call that area the Temple Mount, but in Hebrew it's the Har Habayit, right? So it's the mountain of the house. So when we talk about the temple, it's the house of God. When we talk about the tabernacle, we're talking about the Mishkan, the dwelling, right? And so this is a place that God has chosen to have, an increased presence of God. Like it's a place where God's presence is revealed. God is everywhere, but in almost everywhere in the world, God's presence is hidden. There at the Mishkan and later on the Har HaBayit, so there God's presence was revealed. How was it revealed? Well, while the children of Israel were in the desert, there was this pillar of cloud that accompanied them by day, a pillar of fire by night. It was the presence of a miracle so that people could look and say, okay, God arranged that miracle. It's like God is with us. God is everywhere, but he arranged that manifestation of God's self so that you could say that this is a dwelling place of God. And so now that we're talking about God's dwelling, we're going to learn out from God's dwelling sort of what the ideal dwelling is on earth for other purposes, right? And so that's why we're going to say that this enclosure, for it to be categorized as a dwelling, even though no people live there, well, it can't be bigger than the courtyard of God's dwelling around the tabernacles, right? So that's why, and since that was 50 cubits wide by 100 cubits long, so that courtyard was 5,000 square cubits, and that's going to be the same measure for this enclosure where we're going to permit carrying on Shabbos. This is going to be a short class. We're near the end already. So if you have questions, go ahead and ask them in the comments. So that's where we get this measure of 5,000 square cubits. If you make it a square shape instead of a rectangle, you end up with this 70 and a fraction by 70 and a fraction, which multiplied together, right, adds up to about 5,000 cubits. By the way, the Mishkan itself, the tabernacle, the tent that contained the Holy of Holies and the Ark of the Covenant, etc., as well as the outer holy, which is the place where there was the inner altar that the priests would use. So that structure, that tent structure, was 30 cubits long by 10 cubits wide. And so it's located in one half of the courtyard. The front of the tent is right at the midpoint of that large rectangle of the courtyard, in case you're curious about those dimensions. Those dimensions, the dimensions of the tabernacle, the dimensions of the courtyard, get used for a lot of different laws that the sages will need. If they're looking for a source of measures and limitations and minimum sizes and maximum sizes, they're going to look to this dwelling place of God on earth as a place to get those numbers, as it were. And we learn out that the law is according to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yosei. So an enclosure that we can carry in on Shabbos and not be transgressing the law of carrying, as long as, and we're not talking about a courtyard that's attached to a dwelling. We already learned that that can be much larger. This is an enclosure that is not attached to a dwelling, does not have a dwelling in it. None of that is required. It just needs to be enclosed. So it won't, the corner posts that we use around a well, that's not going to be sufficient. Here in this daf, it's described as a belt, right? A belt around this plot of land. And that's figuratively speaking. But a typical way to make an enclosure would be with posts, like fence posts, that have to be at least 10 handbreadths high. And then you could use wood boards to connect the fence posts, or you could even do it with ropes. And then the key is that there's going to be no more than 3 handbreadths gap between one rope and the next rope that creates this enclosure around that area. Now you've made a defined enclosure and a defined courtyard. And if we were in that place on Shabbos and we needed to carry something from one part of the courtyard to another, we could do it without violating Shabbos. And that is the law according to Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Yosei, and that is the law. Okay, that's what I've got for us today. This was a more compact daf than the ones that we've been studying lately. Let's see. Got one question here from Lucy Rom Johnson. I'm searching to understand Eruvs better. I ran across the remarkable work of Miriam Levy, an MIT master's thesis in architecture about the Eruv. I especially like the section on the ethics of the Eruv, starting on page 82. Some of this is quite beautiful as well as informative. I'm not familiar with that. We're including the link to that thesis, and if people are curious about Miss Levy's take on an Eruv, there you go. Let me see the other comments. Nina had to go, so I'm just scanning the comments myself. Bill Eldridge says, a professor of mine from Italy told me once that in some parts of Italy and France, they still live in villages or towns, but farm outside of it. Apparently, they just never stopped doing so. I imagine, therefore, that such an arrangement is common in many tucked away corners of the world. I would think so. I mean, and it's sort of, that's going to make sense anywhere where there's danger, right? So for sure, this makes sense in the ancient world where, new powers, as it were, right? New armies, new kings that want to expand their domain. They're coming along at any time. I remember reading the book The Source by James Mishna. It's quite interesting, set in the Holy Land, and looking at sort of one piece of land and who lived there, and telling stories of the people who lived there, in many different, in several different centuries, right? Over a span of thousands of years, just looking at some cultures that were there at different times. And then it's just so interesting how does an era end, especially in the ancient world? Some conquering army comes along and people have been living in a certain way for, decades or even centuries. And all of a sudden this new power comes along. They appear one day and, just take over, kill a lot of people, sweep it away, and, maybe relocate the people who were there or enslave them. Really your whole world can change so fast. So when you're aware that the world is a dangerous place like that, it makes sense to live in a community that is protected and not out there on your own. And so when you think about, the American homesteaders who went out in the 1700s and 1800s, and set up farms in these wide open spaces, but fully exposed, it was a dangerous time and place. Those were really brave people who settled, this vast open continent to create the United States as we know it now. And it's interesting. Thank you, Bill, for sharing that some people still live that way. It makes sense. Sharon Frank Brooks says they live similarly in rural Poland when my dad lived there, with the landowners and workers lived in the towns and the farmland was outside the towns. Really fascinating. Okay, is that it for the comments? Not seeing any others. Nope, that's it. Okay, so, and well, Gwen said 70 by 70 is 5,000 square cubits. How many acres is that? I don't know. But if it's about 100 feet by 100 feet, I don't know that much about acres. Like I grew up, I think that my family had way out in the suburbs where land was inexpensive. It was like a third of an acre. I'm guessing that 100 feet by 100 feet, somebody else can tell us better, but maybe it's a fifth of an acre, something like that. I don't really know. But at any rate, that's what I've got for us today. And it's great learning with you guys. And so tomorrow we will continue with our discussion of that fourth mission. I think we're going to get into the fifth as well. It's been exciting. Eruvin is so technical, but when you allow it to sort of like imagine what these spaces were like and how people lived 2,000 years ago and how they adjusted those living spaces, to enter that different frame of life, that different mode of living on Shabbos, it's so interesting. And plus, we've had these sudden digressions, into beautiful teachings about why does God permit evil in the world? Why does God let good go unrewarded for as long as he does? We had that in the last couple days. So who knows what the next set of digressions will bring and when it will come up. It's great learning with you.